G'day everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. In week 2 of the series, We Need You to Lead, Adam talks about filling the gaps. Do you fill in the gaps with trust or suspicion? Adam takes a closer look at Saul and what we can learn from his story in 1 Samuel.
If I could just touch on Sleepy Rooster Sessions for just a second. You know, the thing about that whole experience and that what they're creating there that's exciting to me is some of you remember this last August we did a series called What the What. It felt like it was time for us to give some explanation as to like what observations of God and his character have we made that really drive the why behind Narrate. And one of the things that we spend a lot of energy on is a theological idea called the cultural commission. It's an observation made from the opening pages of Genesis where you see that God created people and he created all that's around us, and yet he didn't complete it. It was like he dumped us in a world full of Legos and said, like, get to work, put your hands in the soil, make something of this. And so it was in that conversation, in that series where we talked much about there have been times over the last couple thousand years where the church has been at the center of creating culture and moving things forward and serving the common good. And then there have been other times over the last couple thousand years of church history where the church has, instead of creating culture, adopted a posture of critiquing and condemning culture. And we said right then and there that our desire, and we feel like the way God has pointed us, is to be an organization, a community, a people who are creating culture, who aren't caught up in critiquing, but just voting with our feet and being the type of place that matters for the common good. And so where it's been very fun for me is to come alongside of Kate on this and Sarah and the team that's worked so hard. But because it's not a Narrate thing, it's a consortium of community members, some of whom follow Jesus, some of whom don't, some of whom are associated with Narrate, some aren't. And just to go like, let's just serve people. And so our opportunity is to put a towel over our arm and give it the Narrate experience that we've all come to value and that we think is so important, telling God's story through the excellence of that. Excuse me. One of the stories that Kate shared with me a few weeks ago that for me captures the value of this in just a single story was one of the organizers who's, as far as I know, not connected with church and I know not Narrate, made the comment to her as they were designing it. She just said, well, all I know is if Narrate's involved, it'll be an excellent experience. And that, I think, is something that we all kind of pump our fist and go, yes, like that's narrating God's story the way we would like to. So thanks for trusting us. I understand that when you put that much beer on the screen at church, that gets very uncomfortable. And so thanks for trusting us with all that. This morning, we're going to jump back into that We Need You to Lead series. And I think maybe the best way to start is just to get you thinking about your style. Ever thought about the fact that you have one, or I understand you've been talking about labels, style, real similar things, but have you ever thought about what your style is? And see, when you ask the question, what you discover is you have several styles. It's not a singular, it's a plural. Like, sure, you have a fashion style, and that's probably what we think of first. There's a way that you're trying to present yourself. And you also have a communication style. You have a certain way of talking to people, not only in terms of accent and vocabulary, but there's a culture to the way you treat people with language. There's a style to the type of music you like to listen to, a style to the type of food, that you like to eat. There's a style to the type of TV shows that you like to watch. There's a style to the type of athletes that you like to support. There's a style to the way you decorate your room or your house. Your family has a style. I think part of what's fascinating about being in junior high and high school is you start to discover that not every family has your family's style, and you start comparing and contrasting, and that creates its own conversations. This last Sunday, do you remember how nice it was this last Sunday? It turns out it's that nice again, it seems like. Anyway, Teresa and I, we were like, hey, we got to get the boys out of the house. We got to go do something physical. And so we invited some friends and ended up being 7 of us who went up to Cox Lake and hiked down Rodney Ridge. And it was my crew, and then Sarah and Kate joined us. And at one point as we were hiking along, the thing I love about hiking is it's kind of like a chairlift. Like there's no screen, there's nothing to do but have a conversation. And at one point, Sarah had shared that she was homeschooled for a lot of her growing up years. And one of our sons, who shall remain anonymous, was like, I wish I was homeschooled. Now, that wasn't new information to Teresa and I. Like, he's actually a really good candidate for homeschooling. The problem is neither of his parents are good candidates to homeschool him. So he's just kind of got to deal with the hand that he's dealt. And so I think it was Teresa, my wife, she kind of instinctively said, why? Why do you wish you were homeschooled? And this is one of those moments, I was back on that trail yesterday. I could take you to the spot on the trail where the question was asked, because there was this profound sense of anticipation. Like, if you're going to say you wish you were homeschooled, you better come up with something profound as to why, right? And there was a pause, and it was obvious he was thinking about it. And finally, after a few moments, he said, because when you're homeschooled, your cheese is never warm. There's a style to the way you like your lunch, right? There's that thing that peanut butter and jelly can do with bread, and revolting, disgusting. We could probably vote. Some people even marketed that round, nasty thing that kind of is captivating for those of you who like the three becoming one kind of peanut butter. There's a style to the type of food you like. And though that series video is hilarious in its own right, really what we're trying to get at in this series is there's a style to your leadership. And whether you think of yourself as a leader or not, whether you're in 6th grade or you're 60 years old and the president of a bank, you lead. With or without title, with or without position, with or without age, you lead. And the tendency that we have, that we talked about last week, is we find ourselves in situations on teams, in classrooms, in companies, in families, among friends, where the situation begs for someone to rise up and lead. And the problem is, if we don't think of ourselves as a leader, if no one's ever called us a leader, rather than lead, we just cower. And we wait for a great leader to come along and rescue us. And yet, what we're exploring in this series is what if we need you to lead? What if leaders aren't people with title and position or even ownership, but people who do difficult things in difficult circumstances, who have certain principles to them? And so last week we talked about bullets, not silver bullets, bullets, then cannonballs. And part of what I'm trying to do in this series is I'm a plagiarist at heart. And so what I'm trying to do is take language from the leadership business world that we can all use in our everyday lives. And so this morning I want to ask this question, and let me just say before I get into it, I am indebted this morning to my friend Fred Nelson and Brian Hopkins and Derry Long from Journey Church in Bozeman, as well as Vern in Billings. I'm also indebted to Patrick Lencioni and Andy Stanley. These are ideas that I've been working on for, my entire adult life. And every once in a while, I get to talk about something up here that I feel like I'm good at. But just to be clear, this isn't one of them. This is extraordinarily difficult stuff. It's stuff that I found myself this week working on it in my office, and then I'd walk out of my office and practice the exact opposite. So please don't sense a bony finger coming from me, because we're together on this. I'm as broken as you are, but I think it's an important question. The question is simply this: how do you fill in the gaps? Now that's vague. But ultimately what I want to get you thinking about this morning is, what is your default position when someone doesn't live up to an expectation? Thus a gap. When somebody doesn't do what they said they would do, when you're disappointed in the way someone behaves or talks, how do you respond to that gap? What do you do with that? Now here would be an example. Let's just say that you and I, we agree that tomorrow we're going to meet at the office, and we're going to have a meeting at 9 o'clock, and it's not just you and I, but there's several people from the staff, and we're all going to meet at 9 o'clock. And so tomorrow morning comes along, and it's 9 o'clock, and you show up, and the rest of the staff shows up, and I don't. And it's 9:05, and you just start the meeting without me. 9:10, I'm still not there. 9:15, I'm still not there. 9:20, I finally walk in the door. See, what's happened is a gap has just formed, right? Now, that gap might cost me my job, but nonetheless, there's a gap that's formed. There's something that you expected me to do, and I didn't do it. There's something I said I would do, and I didn't do it. And I guess the question that I want to get you thinking about this morning is what if not only do you deal with those repeatedly throughout the day, but what if there's really a very predictable way in which you fill in that gap? That all of us basically have one of two options when it comes to filling in that gap. That you can fill it in with trust, or you can fill it in with suspicion. Now, to fill it in with trust is to go, okay, listen, I know Adam. I understand how much he loves his job. I understand how hard he works. I understand how committed he is to this project. And so therefore, I'm going to assume there's information I don't have, but if I knew that, I would agree with him for being 20 minutes late. It's to give me the benefit of the doubt. And to fill it in with suspicion is to go, I knew it. I knew he hated me. I knew he was out to get me. I knew he was looking for a new job. I knew he didn't want to be a part of this project. I knew he was taking me for granted. I knew he was starting to take advantage of the privileges I give him. I knew it. And what if we do that over and over and over? Let's try this one. You shoot somebody a text message, and they don't text back. And it's an hour, which feels like a week. And it's a day, which feels like a year. And it's a couple days. And there's a gap that's formed, right? Because there's somebody that you just extended a hand of friendship. Maybe you invited them over to your house. Maybe you invited them to a meeting. Maybe you invited to go do something. And they didn't respond. A gap has formed. Ever shot somebody an email and a week later realized they didn't email you back? Ever had your friends get told by their parents that they could stay out till midnight, and then you came home and you asked your parents, like, hey, friends are doing this. Could I stay out till midnight under these special circumstances? And you go, no. Then your parents say, no, it's still 10 o'clock. And you guys are going like, whose lame parents are that? 10 o'clock. But there's a gap, right? Like you had a hope. There was an expectation, and now a gap has formed. And in that moment, we decide, don't we, that our parents are trying to destroy our social life, that they're out to get us, or we trust them. You know where I see this the most, and those of you, I don't mean this patronizing, well, I won't even say it because it is patronizing, but it was reaffirmed to me actually after the first service. I think where this becomes the biggest deal is when something big happens in life. Like you just worked your dogs off for a week and a boss doesn't acknowledge that you did. Or you and your wife or you and your husband, you have a baby. And there's this friend and you thought they were a good friend and they not only did they not show up at the hospital, they don't even call. Or like your mom dies or your son is sick. And there's this family member and there's this friend and you thought they were the type that you could lean on and they don't even acknowledge that it's happened. You're going through a divorce and it hurts. And there's someone that you thought you could count on who just ignores, or at least that's what you think, that it's even happening. See, in those moments, gaps form. And I guess what I want to suggest to you is that there's a predictable, repeated pattern to the way we fill them in. And the way we fill them in, what if that has a dramatic impact on the culture of you, the type of person you become, the type of organization that you lead or work in, the culture of your home, the culture of your friendships? You know, as I was processing that, and again, I do D- work in this area, so I'm not coming to you as one arrived. But recently I've been fascinated once again. One of my favorite books in the Old Testament is the book of 1 Samuel. And listen, if you've never read the Bible and you find it daunting, or if you find that you're just kind of stuck, 1 Samuel is such an incredible book because the characters, it moves quickly. It's just an awesome, if you think the Bible is the most boring thing ever, read 1 Samuel. It's so good. But one of the things that I was reminded of as I was reworking through some of this material for reasons I'll share in just a minute, I was reminded of the story of Saul. And you might not remember the story of Saul. Maybe you've never heard the story of Saul, but Saul's story is in one sense incredibly promising and in another sense unbelievably tragic. See, Saul's story, it started innocently enough. He was at some age where he was still under his dad's supervision. He was hanging out. His dad came up to him and said, hey, Saul, the donkeys are gone. And I know you hate it when your dad comes and says, like, the donkeys are gone, right? This is the most inconvenient thing. And so he says to Saul, hey Saul, would you grab some guys, grab some buddies, and would you go looking for the donkeys? And so Saul grabs his iPhone and he throws some food in his backpack and he grabs some friends and they start wandering looking for these donkeys. Now, it's 1 day, it's 2 days, and suddenly one of the guys is like, dude, we haven't found the donkeys yet. I'll bet you your dad's not worried about them anymore, though I'll bet he's worried about you because we've been gone for so long. And about the time that they're considering going back and having not found the donkeys, one of the guys says, hey, over the hill, there's this town, and in that town there's this guy named Samuel, and he's this seer, he's this prophet of God who seems to be able to discern God's will. Maybe he could tell us where the donkeys are. Like he'll look in that crystal ball thing or whatever it is he's got going on, and he'll tell us where the donkeys are. So let's go see Samuel. Now simultaneously, what's going on in Samuel's life, this prophet, this judge, is something entirely different. Samuel has spent his life leading Israel. He's the closest thing they had to a leader at this particular time, but he's getting old, and his sons are pretty broken, and the people are getting nervous, and the people of Israel are recognizing that the surrounding nations, they don't have prophets anymore. They have kings. And so they start saying to God, and then to Samuel, listen, we don't want this kind of nerdy crystal ball prophet thing anymore. We want a king. We want a palace. We want this official guy who wears a crown and has a house, who's the government and military leader and in many ways speaks into the spiritual life. Give us a king. Now, God's not crazy about that situation. Either is Samuel, but God obliges. And God says to Samuel, this is where it gets crazy. God says to Samuel, hey, Samuel, in just a little bit, someday soon, a guy's going to come walking into the village. He's going to do these 3 things, these 4 things, and when he does, you'll know that's the king. So there's these two stories kind of parallel coming together. So Saul walks into town, walks into the village. He does the very things that God told Samuel the next king would do. And so eventually Saul goes to Samuel and he says, hey, Samuel, where are the donkeys? And Samuel's like, don't worry about the donkeys. Your dad's already found the donkeys. Now he's looking for you. But hold on, I've got some news for you. What's that? He says, you're going to be the king of Israel. And Saul is like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, you don't know who you're talking about. Like, I've never been student body president. I've never been class president. Like, when I fill out college applications that say, like, where did you volunteer? I just say, I'll pay the extra money. Like, I've never led anything. You have no idea what I did last Friday night. No, I'm not your guy. Saul is this incredibly reluctant leader. In fact, I love the story, the sentence that captured it is, it says this. It says, Saul answered, but am I not a Benjamite? From the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans in the tribe of Benjamin? Like, my dad's not a doctor, he's not a lawyer, my dad doesn't have a job. Like, no, I can't be that guy. Why do you say such a thing to me? Ain't happening. And they have this kind of like agree to disagree moment, and Saul goes back to the donkeys, and Samuel goes back to the prophet thing, and eventually Samuel decides that they're going to have the first ever inauguration for the king of Israel. And so he sends out the news, and he blows the trumpets, and all the people from Israel, they converge on this spot, and they're all waiting to find out what. That was a very large yawn. Sorry. I feel very secure, though. Sorry to pick on you. I yawn all the time. So here we go. So they have this big old thing, and they're all asking this question, like, who's going to be the king? And so Samuel rolls in, and they do this thing that's really weird to us. What they do is they call it casting lots, and what in the Old Testament, leaders like Samuel would use casting lots to work with God to know God's will. And it sounds really weird. It sounds almost like gambling to us, but it's what they did. And so Samuel walks in, and what that ultimately looks like is he walks into the room, he's like, hey, anybody got a hat? Somebody hands him their crusty hat. And Samuel takes a piece of paper, and he rips it up into 12 chunks, and he writes the 12 names of the 12 tribes of Israel on those chunks of paper. He throws it in the hat. He reaches in, believing that God will guide his hand to which tribe he's going to grab. He reaches in, grabs a name out, hands it to Vanna. Vanna puts up on the board, like, Benjamites. Did you know Vanna was born in 1957? I was looking at that this week. She's like the ageless wonder. Anyway, so he puts up Benjamites. So all the other tribes, they sit down and they go find something else to do. And then Samuel dumps those names out on the ground, puts in the hat the names of all the clans of Benjamin. Samuel reaches in, pulls out a name, turns around, hands it to Vanna. She puts it up there. It's the same clan that Saul's from. It's his dad's clan. Dumps those out on the ground, takes and writes down the name of all the men of age in that clan. Sorry, ladies, different culture, no offense. Puts the names of all those men in the hat. Samuel reaches in, and whose name do you suppose he pulls out? He pulls out Saul's name. And everyone's like, there's Saul, he's our mighty king. Where's Saul? And I just think it's indicative of God's sense of humor, because the text takes the time to tell us that they so couldn't find Saul that eventually Samuel had to go like, hey, God, is Saul anywhere around here? And listen to what God says. And the Lord said, yes, he's hidden himself among the supplies. So it's like, you got to go like look next to the 2x4s, underneath the sheetrock, next to the plaster. Like Saul's hanging out down there because he so doesn't want to be king or doesn't feel qualified to be king. Eventually they drag him out by his ear, and Saul's standing in front of the people. And then the text says a fight erupts. Because like the kid who was the student body president, he's going, he's not our leader, I'm the leader. And the one who actually did go to college, he's going, he shouldn't be our leader, I should be our leader. And the text, I think this says it all about Saul's character. The text says Saul was just silent. Didn't defend himself once, just took it. See, with a leader like that, aren't those the type of guys you want to hire? Aren't those the type of women that you want to like have work for your company? Are those the type of friends that you want? There's this humility of like, no, he's not aspiring to this. And it begs this question, like, wow, with a start like that, wouldn't you expect incredible things from Saul? And of course, the answer is, of course you would. And the tragedy of the story is, so did God. Like, that's the way the story started. God had incredible things in store for Saul. Saul was this guy of incredible, incredible hope and promise. And yet, lest I, or at the risk of, or I am going to ruin the ending for you, Saul's story, it ends exact opposite of the way it begins. In fact, when Saul dies, and I know some of you don't think you ever die because that's I'm just starting to realize I'll die someday. But when Saul dies, he has no family. He has no spiritual life to speak of. He has no leadership. Everything that he hoped and dreamt for, everything that he worked on, everything that God said, you can do this, none of it happened. He was an embarrassment to his clan, to his tribe, to his country, to himself, to everyone involved. His story is the epitome of tragedy. And when you read through it, and I hope you do, one of the questions becomes, why? Why did it go so wrong for Saul? And one of the observations that you can make is that every time there was a gap, every time Paul had to choose between security and insecurity, every time Saul had to choose between trust and suspicion, it seems that every time he goes the way of suspicion. Every time he goes, they didn't return my text message because they hate me and they're never going to talk to me again. I don't have any friends on Friday night because the whole world hates me. Every time I'm about to get fired, whatever. Every time he goes with the negative. You know, one of those instances is at one point David comes marching into town. David's the guy who killed Goliath and kind of a big deal, was his VP, if you will, or his general, had incredible success in the organization. And the crowd says this as David shows up. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. I mean, they used to think you were good, but they think they're incredible. This is like, it's not the point guard for the varsity team who's getting all the attention. It's the one for the JV team. There's a gap. And listen to what Saul says, or what the text says about Saul. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? It was never even in David's mind to steal the kingdom. But Saul starts getting freaky and insecure, and he fills in the gap with suspicion. And listen to what it says. And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. There's another example. Saul, he gave his daughter Michal to be married to David. Now, there was some things going on there that we won't get into as to why he did that. But nonetheless, this day happens. And listen, I'm guessing any father of a daughter, I don't have a daughter, but I'm guessing all of you either have had this day happen or you dread this day. There's a day coming where you'll realize that your daughter loves her husband more than you. And that's what Saul experiences. There's this moment where he realizes that Michal is more committed to David than to him. The text says it this way. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, and then listen to this, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Every time Saul has to deal with, why didn't they return my text? Every time, why were they late for the meeting? Why are they late with that project? Every time he goes the way of suspicion. You know, what brought all this back to mind for me was several weeks ago, I had one of those moments where I realized that I had this friend that I hadn't seen for a while, and our lives have gotten busy, and so we just hadn't crossed paths for a long time, and there were some emails exchanged kind of along that, like, hey, haven't heard from you in a while, hope you're doing all right, sorry I've neglected you. And in the process of that there was the realization that there was actually probably some hurt that was going on, and something that was occurring that needed to be taken care of. And so we sat down and we had coffee, and it was one of those real uncomfortable conversations. Because in the midst of the conversation, that there were tears shed, there was confessions made, there was acknowledgement of like, oh, sorry about that was made. And about halfway through the conversation, I couldn't help. I just kind of stopped the whole thing because I was reminded of all of this, not like you need to do this, but like, oh, geez, I'm terrible at this. And I just verbalized, I said, you know something, all of this reminds me of something, and that is simply this. The way we manage unmet expectations is a big, big deal. And I can't point to a study, but I'll bet you there's a really strong relationship between healthy people and safe people and good bosses and great parents and good friends. I'll bet you they're the types of people who, when there's a gap, they can fill it in with trust. And they don't assume the worst, but quite the opposite. And all that just got me thinking of, okay, Lord, I'm terrible at this. I do it more than anybody. And so it forced me back into a bunch of different resources. Many of them, all of them, hopefully are listed on that mind map notes page. because I don't have any new ideas. I'm just a plagiarist. But it did help me kind of boil it down into, okay, so what are the three things? To kind of combine all the different sources over the years. And I just want to make three observations, and I'm sorry if this feels a little clinical, but I feel like this is so important in our everyday lives because we all deal with these gaps over and over and over again, and it's so important to our companies and families that I just want to get really practical. And so the number one thing is simply this that I've been reminded: give others the benefit of the doubt you give yourself. Just, Jesus talks about love God as you love yourself. He talks about do unto others what you'd want them to do to you. And when it comes to a gap, there's something, Patrick Lencioni in a book called The Advantage, he talks about this actual phrase called the fundamental attribution error. And that's a big word. You put that in a paper, you're getting an A. But the fundamental attribution error says this. It says that when you create a gap, when they create a gap, when somebody else creates a gap, when an employee, a friend, a kid, a spouse, when someone else creates a gap, when someone else doesn't line up to an expectation, you attribute that to their character, to their personality, to their motives, to what some would just simply call their heart. When they screw up, it's because they're a jerk, they've got it out for you, they're unkind, there's something wrong with their character. But when you create the same gap, you attribute it to your environment. See, when they're late, it's because they don't care about their job anymore. When you're late, it's because you're such a good mom that you attended to your needs as kids, and so of course you're 5 minutes late. When they don't deliver a project, it's because they're taking the company for granted. But when you don't, it's because you've got so much to do. When they don't respond to an email, it's because they hate you and they have it out for you and they're conspiring with all your friends to not talk to you anymore. But when you don't respond to an email, it's because do you have any idea how many emails I get? I'm sorry. So what if you could just give others the benefit of the doubt that you give yourself? And of course, the next question becomes, okay, but what happens when the same gap forms over and over and over and over again? Because there's a fine line between being a person who extends grace and a person who's a pushover. And that's what makes leadership so difficult is, how do I find that line? And this is where I'm particularly indebted to some observations Andy Stanley made, where he simply says that when the conversation's happening in your head, like you're driving home or you're walking to school, you're walking into the office or at the end of the day, and you're having the confrontation in your own head, because they've done it again and again and again. When you're hashing it out, and especially when you hash it out so much that you can't think about anything else, and then you hash it out so vividly you don't even have to do it in real time, that's when a conversation is needed. And yet the catch is, even when you have the conversation, go ahead to that number 2, when trust runs out, have a trust-centric conversation. Even when you have the conversation, you get to choose between trust and suspicion. You can sit across from them and go, you no good, blah, 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 blah. Or you can sit across from them and go, listen, I'm assuming that there's information I don't have. I'm assuming that there's something going on in your life, there's something going on with your family. I'm assuming there's something that happened that explains why you've not emailed me back or why you're always late. So I'm struggling. Could you just give me that information? I love the way Lencioni says it. He says it this way. Go ahead to the next slide. He says, when there's trust, conflict becomes nothing more than the pursuit of truth in an attempt to find the best possible answer. Hey, listen, I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, so we gotta understand what's going on here. Help me, give me the information I don't have. And the third thing, and I think this may be the biggest one of all, is give the gift of trustworthiness. Don't just trust others, but be a trustworthy person. Now that sounds like a loaded term. Let me ask you this: who do you find trustworthy? Employees, friends, who never make a mistake? Well, that's not even realistic, is it? Aren't the people that you trust the most, that you find the most safe? It's not that they're perfect. It's that when they're imperfect, when they create a gap, they're willing to admit it. And in fact, ideally speaking, trustworthy people, what they do is they acknowledge the gap before you've even noticed the gap. The employees that you find trustworthy are the ones who call you and tell you they're going to be late before they're late. They're the ones who tell you, hey, I'm not going to be able to deliver this project before you even know that the project's going to be late. That they're the type of people who acknowledge their stuff before anyone else even notices. We're all after unique and rare in our culture. Everything is about be the only one with this identity, and that's such a facade. You know what's rare? people who are open with the fact that they're imperfect, and they're not trying to zip themselves up and put on a persona of perfection, and they don't have to defend themselves every time. You know what's rare? People who acknowledge when they've screwed up, and they grin and they take whatever consequences might come with that. You know, I think part of what drives us to be the church the way we are is born of this sense that for so many people, their understanding of God is a God who says, you better measure up. And when your theology measures up well enough, then you can be loved by God like we are. It's the opposite of what Jesus taught. Jesus' teaching was, listen, you can't measure up. That's why I came. That's why I did what I did. Jesus' message was, you're not going to be able to measure up. In John 3:19, he gives us what he's really after. Sorry, I don't apparently know where 3:19's at. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world. That's Jesus. But people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. What's John saying? Here's the verdict. People would much rather put on a facade of perfection than they would humble themselves and admit to God and others that they're imperfect. What if you could somehow adopt the humility to go, God, I understand that you need to be perfect, and Jesus took care of that, and my role now is to step into a relationship with you where you grow and you teach and I confess. You know, I'm really not being superficial when I say I find this so difficult, and I've wrestled all week with, so Lord, how do I grow in this regard? Here's what I'm doing, and you can try it if you like. My goal this week is to, at the end of the day, take an inventory and find one time in the day. My goal is throughout the days, once a day for the next week, to find one circumstance that I quickly identify there's a gap. And just once a day to purposely, intentionally, strategically go, okay, my tendency here would be to get really insecure and take it personal and get all bent out of shape because they didn't ask me to lunch, they asked them to lunch, or because they were late for work or whatever. And instead, I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to assume there's information I don't have and it's not personal. And I'm going to extend trust in that direction. Let me pray for you. God, Lord, this is tough stuff. And yet I'm also convinced by my own experience and the experience of friends that this is also what makes life tough. Because we're relational beings and we're in dire need of your and others' acceptance, and we want our value affirmed, though we know that it's best to get that from you. God, would you make us the types of people who, when we have to pick between insecurity and trust, we pick trust. Who, when we're tempted to be offended and fabricate all kinds of facts that may not even be true, we have conversations. And God, would you make us the types of employees and community members and family members and friends who are trustworthy, who aren't trying to zip ourselves up and give on a persona of perfection, but who are humbly aware of our brokenness. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.